So we're on the third part of our 3-week series on the Shroud of Turin. And just to clarify, the Shroud of Turin is a linen cloth 14 feet wide by about 3 and 7 inches, I guess we'll say deep since I said wide, long and wide. And on it is a faint image of a crucified man, and it would appear that could be Jesus. That's kind of the whole point of it, right? So the first week we went over the question, is the shroud a forgery? And we considered that a forgery would be almost impossible. There's like 30 unusual or bizarre features on the shroud that would have to be somehow put together in some sort of way, some sort of method to do that, and that just is almost an impossible challenge. And most of them are even too small to even be visible to the eye. And this would have had to happen in medieval times, and so how in the world are they going to do all these super small things, even know what it is they're looking for or trying to reproduce? It's just an impossible thing. And by the way, they would have to do that with no modern technology, which again just makes it harder and harder to imagine how this could possibly be a forgery. And to even make matters like 10 times worse, scientists today have been trying for 50 years to reproduce an image like this and have failed over and over. And they have tried and tried. In fact, it's the most studied artifact in the history of mankind, and they've been trying to reproduce this image, and they can't do it. So looking at that and some other things that we looked at, it just seems like it's just impossible that the Shroud of Turin could be a forgery. The second week we looked at is who is the man in the shroud? And a couple things came up. Number one, we looked at the history, the flowers and the pollen and the limestone. All the science points it back to Jerusalem. And in some cases before the 8th century, where the scientific evidence of the flowers and stuff dated it back, and some history things even pointed it all the way to the 1st century. We also looked at the Bible, how it would fit Scripture, and it appears to fit everywhere we look. It fits Roman crucifixion, things about the shroud that medieval people wouldn't even be aware of, because what we know now about Roman history crucifixion seemed to be true in the shroud. Again, making it impossible for a forger to know what we know today, what was not known in their times. And last of all, we looked at the chances of the Shroud of Turin and Jesus Christ as described in the Gospels, how those two events could match so perfectly. And Stevenson and Habermas did a calculation where they looked at the unique features of each, and they came up with and they felt it was a conservative estimate, by the way, was 1 in 82,944,000 odds that you would have the shroud match the Gospels if it wasn't the same person. It just has to be the same person, is what they felt. So now we get to the third week, the final week. What happened to the body? And this is my favorite. This is my favorite of it all. What happened to the body? So just to clarify, science is stumped on this. We've already said this. Now, after 50 years, again, it's the most studied artifact in human history. Haven't been able to come up with anything. And scientific testing and medical analysis have eliminated every single proposed naturalistic and artistic attempt to duplicate the shroud's unique and full-length image. They've tried and tried, and then they've looked at every possible way you could do it and have eliminated those possibilities scientifically. There's just no way. They've tried things like heat. There's no way. That goes too deep. It's not superficial enough. They've tried vapors. No, that creates a warped image. I mean, it just goes on and on and on, where they've tried to duplicate, and they've said, no, scientifically that doesn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. Consider this. Paul stood before the Areopagus, and he said, he has set a day on which he is going to judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he designated, having provided proof to everyone by raising him from the dead. The resurrection is really the thing that we have to look to as a possibility. Could the shroud be part of that proof of the resurrection? In 1989, Dr. Jackson, who was the leader of STIRRUP, was the Shroud of Turin research project, and physicist Thomas Phillips speculated that the shroud image was formed by neutron radiation caused by a miraculous bodily resurrection. Now think about it. Can radiation cause or be the account for over 30 unique image features that we're finding on the shroud? Could that possibly be, could this be the answer that makes everything fit together? Well, let's look at that. So here are some fiber images of the shroud, and I think that's right around the nose. And you see how superficial, meaning right on the top, you can't even see where they're darkened hardly. And then right below it is an irradiated linen of modern day, where they took some linen and they radiated it, and that's what they got. And so let's look at what they found to be similar between the two. The irradiated linen loses its natural fluorescence, same as the shroud. When they put ultraviolet light on the shroud, there's no fluorescence where the image is. Same thing on this linen. The irradiated linen is dehydrated, oxidized, degraded cellulose. That's exactly what's on the shroud when it gets irradiated. Irradiated linen yellows faster. Same on the shroud. And in fact, the shroud the image would not have, by the way, yellowed right after it happened. It takes time. It's an aging process because it gets dehydrated, and so it ages faster than the rest of the cloth. Hence, we have an image. But it wouldn't have been right away, which is an interesting thing to think about, because that would explain why the disciples, maybe who found the cloth, didn't look at it and say, oh, look, there's an image on it, because there would have been no image on it. The straw yellow coloration could not be removed when STIRRUP, again, that's the Shroud of Turin research project, applied an entire range of acids, bases, organic solvents, oxidants, and reductants to a shroud image sample, except for one thing worked, and that was diamide. That would remove the image from the fibers. It did the same thing with the linen. So once again, it's matching, that an irradiation to the linen matches what maybe happened to the shroud. So could a miraculous bodily resurrection through radiation be the cause of the image on the shroud? That's the question the scientists are asking themselves. So next, Jackson developed the radiation fall-through hypothesis, which he and other scientists have refined over the years, which accounts for most of the perplexing shroud features. Following his hypothesis in 1990, Jackson postulated the presence of a secondary superficial image on the back of the shroud. So he had this hypothesis that it's irradiated, and through that he's like, I think there's something on the backside. What's interesting is the back of the shroud has been covered since 1534, so there's no way to even look at it, because of that fire that we discussed in our first week. But in 2002, the shroud was restored, and the cloth backing and 30 patches were removed, making it possible to photograph the reverse side of the cloth, which had been hidden in view since 1532. Here's what happened. So in a peer-reviewed publication comes out what some doctors were looking at, some scientists. The double superficiality of the frontal image of the Turin of Shroud. When they say double superficiality, they meant the front and the back, both visible. So down below, we get to the abstract, and this came out in 2004, 2 years after the shroud was uncovered. And it says, the photographs of the back surface of the Turin shroud were analyzed to verify the existence of a double body image of a man. The body image is very faint, in the background not uniform. That is, the signal-to-noise ratio is lower than 1. Therefore, image processing developed ad hoc was necessary to highlight body features. This was based on convolution with Gaussian filters, summation of images, and filtering in spatial frequency by direct and inverse bidimensional Fourier transformations. Body features were identified by template matching. The face and probably also the hands are visible on the back of the Turin shroud, but not features related to the dorsal image, meaning the backside. So Jackson's postulated secondary superficial image were indeed encoded on the back of the shroud, as he had thought. So then more scientists got on board with the fall-through hypothesis. In Express, we see this come out. Jesus' image on Turin shroud caused by radiation, claim Italian scientists. Radiation from an earthquake may be responsible for the Turin shroud image many believe to be depicted by Jesus Christ. A team of Italian scientists claim a powerful magnitude 8.2 quake, which occurred in Old Jerusalem in the year 33 AD, would have been strong enough to release neutron particles from crushed rock. The blood of neutrons may have imprinted an X-ray-like image of Jesus onto the 14-foot linen burial cloth by reacting with nitrogen nuclei. Radiation emissions could also have increased levels of atomic strains of carbon in the shroud. Professor Alberto, I don't even know if I want to say all that, I'll go on, of Torino, whose theory is published in the journal Mechanica, said, "We believe this could also have caused a wrong radiocarbon dating," which we discussed last week. Radiocarbon dating tests in 1988 suggest the cloth was only 728 years old and therefore a forgery. However, the validity and interpretation of these results have since been debated by historians and scientists. The cloth remains one of the most studied and controversial artifacts in human history. Shroud experts have called on Pope Francis to allow analysis of the material using the latest technology to shed more light on the mystery. So think about it. Neutron particles from an earthquake. I don't know if you were reading that and you would think, an earthquake? Seriously? What's kind of odd about that, I was thinking, now if this guy does not believe that Jesus was resurrected, that's kind of a stretch to say how convenient that there was an earthquake in 33 AD while Jesus was in the tomb and it resurrected him. Or not resurrected, or irradiated him and he was gone. Or he's a believer and he's just, I don't know. But I think it's interesting. It made me think of this verse in Matthew 28. It says, "When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, 'You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble.' So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day." In other words, we need an excuse for what happened to the body. It feels like what that scientist was saying is, we have an excuse for the resurrection, and that is this rock radiated this man that was in the tomb, Jesus, and he disappeared. Anyway, I don't know if I looked and looked to try to find out whether he was an atheist or a Christian, and I couldn't figure it out. But if he wasn't a Christian, then I would say, you're being kind of ridiculous. This is obviously what happened. Or heck, check out this National Geographic article. Why Shroud of Turin's secrets continue to elude science. As the venerated relic goes on public exhibition, its origins remains this mystery wrapped in an enigma. This came out in 2015. Looming above all other issues is what physicist Paolo di Lazzaro calls the question of questions. How the image was produced, regardless of its age. Every scientific attempt to replicate it in a lab has failed. Its precise hue is highly unusual, and the color's penetration into the fabric is extremely thin, less than 0.7 micrometers, 1/30th the diameter of an individual fiber in a single 200-fiber linen thread. Di Lazzaro and his colleagues at Italy's National Agency for New Technologies, Energy and Sustainable Economic Development conducted 5 years of experiments using state-of-the-art excimer lasers to train short bursts of ultraviolet light on raw linen in an effort to simulate the image's coloration. The NEA team, which published its findings in 2011, came tantalizingly close to approximating the image's distinctive hue on few square centimeters of fabric. But they were unable to match all the physical and chemical characteristics of the Shroud's image, nor could they reproduce a whole human figure. The ultraviolet light necessary to do so exceeds the maximum power released by all ultraviolet light sources available today, says DeLazzo. It would require pulses having durations shorter than 1/40 billionth of a second and intensities on the order of several billion watts. If the most advanced technologies available in the 21st century could not produce a facsimile of the Shroud image, he reasons, how could it have been executed by a medieval forger? Could it be that Jesus was resurrected by 1 billion watts of radiation in 1/40 billionth of a second? Well, if God was involved, I guess it would be no problem, would it? At some point, the evidence, doesn't it become like just too much to ignore? We just keep piling it on and piling it on and piling it on. It reminds me of in this passage in Mark 15:33. Now when it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. Around 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, listen, for Elijah. Then someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah will come to take him down. But Jesus cried out with a loud voice and breathed his last, and the temple curtain was torn in two, from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood in front of him saw how he died, he said, truly, this man was God's son. At some point, you have to just say, wait a minute, have I heard enough proof? Have I seen enough? So as the story goes on, in 2015, a book came out called Test the Shroud. Excellent book. I read the book. It's about the same radiation fall-through hypothesis, but there's a slight variation. It has to do with the energy was behind it, whether it was proton energy or UV light energy. And he calls it the historically consistent hypothesis. And this hypothesis goes on to explain all of the known unique features that we find in the Shroud. So let's look at what this radiation fall-through process would look like, and if indeed it explains, and we're going to go through some of the key issues that have been very difficult to explain through natural processes. So number one, do you recall the first week when I talked about how the image was formed only through vertical encoding, which is it's hard to understand what that would even mean, but I took this is my head size right there, okay? So imagine what it would be like is this shroud, if the image was formed only straight through. Now, instead of it considering that the image coding was going up, imagine that all the image coding was from going down because of an instantly disappearing body. So if the body irradiated and disappeared instantly, you would have a dropping shroud. And in fact, even more than a dropping shroud, if you had a disappearing body and the shroud goes like this, there would be an instant suction because it would be a vacuum. It would just be gone. All of a sudden there's a vacuum and the shroud would pull together. And in that moment, the image then would be encoded as the cloth fell through that radiation field. The entire encoding event was completed while the shroud was only 4 centimeters into the radiant body region, leaving many features uncoded. So that radiant energy is only there for just a brief moment as this falls into it. And so that explains why only part of it is being imaged or encoded onto the cloth. Due to the collapse, the shroud was encoded with only vertical information, so the sides and the bottom were not encoded. And this gives an explanation for why we have a 3D image. Because the 3D image, the longer that it's on the cloth is entering the radiation field, the stronger the coating. Therefore, the things at the top would get the most time in the field, such as the nose and the forehead and the hands. And therefore, you get a 3D image based on it falling vertically through top to bottom. The hands created a tent-like structure, causing the pocketed areas around them not to be coated. So those are up a ways, so you have a tent and you have empty spots. So it takes much longer, more than the 4 centimeters, to get all the way down to the pocket areas on the sides, which would explain those dark spots. Even parts of the body that weren't touching the cloth, such as the neck area and the eyes, were encoded as the shroud passed through the radiant body region. The image is sharp because it was encoded before the radiation field dissipated. Normally, you would, with other types of methods, the image was always dull because, like if it was something spreading out, like vapor, it gives an image that's just weak. But this is real sharp because it's still, the radiation field's still in place as it passes right through it. We don't get a warped image because the shroud was encoded only vertically. So when you put something like this around your face, it creates an image that looks quite different. Like if you looked at an image like that all the way around a face. And that's not what we get because the information was only encoded vertically. Horizontal streaks were caused by the shroud slightly rippling as it passed through the radiation field. So if this suddenly dropped, if any of the slightest ripple would explain why you would have maybe a mark going across, which is several going down the shroud. And consider what Dr. Alan Wanger said. The shroud image suggests quite strongly the presence of many skeletal details, for example, carpal and metacarpal bones, some 22 teeth, eye sockets, left femur, left and possibly right thumbs flexed under the palms of the hands, as well as soft tissue and soft tissue injuries, all presumably originating from some form of radiation emitted from the body enshrouded. So here we have some pictures that help to identify those. And if you notice the hands on the shroud, and they almost look spidery. They seem like a little long and spidery. Well, could that be because we're seeing the metacarpal bones, and it makes then the bones, or what you think are the fingers, and so giving it the impression that the whole thing is spidery instead of just that you're looking through into the skeletal features below. And then on this side-by-side, and here's Dr. Gary Habermas says, his skin is intact, his beard is intact, but you're able to see what's inside coming out, just like if you're able to see what's on the back of a hand. The teeth are on the inside, but on the photo, they are showing on the outside. And this is a polarized view to try to give that super high contrast. And it would appear that these teeth are pushing through, or that they're showing right through where the lips are. And here's another side-by-side image. And in here, you look kind of at the bones right here above the eyes, and they look like they're somewhat protruding. And so is that actually because those are higher, or are the bones taking a little stronger presence, like an X-ray? And then we get to Robert Rucker's work. And what he does is he's a nuclear engineer, and he explains maybe what happened to the carbon-14 dating. So when we look at the dating, here was the sample that I mentioned last week. So in the upper left-hand corner is where they took pieces of the shroud and sent them off to 3 different places to be analyzed with carbon-14. And the white pullout right there shows the 3 different samples that they took. So the results that came back that the further away you were from the body image, the younger the samples returned. And so it would appear that it makes a difference how far you are from the image that was being created, radiated, of what the dating would be on each sample. So as a nuclear engineer, he spent many years trying to make sense of this, and he made, to the left, a diagram of what you would expect the dating of carbon-14 to be if you had a sample of the cloth from that part of that area of the cloth. So the closer you are to the center of gravity, or to the center of the mass, I should say, the stronger you would have a result of carbon. In fact, it goes into the negative, into the future. There's so much carbon put into the middle. And then as you go on to the edges, it gets less and less and less. So then on the right, he looked at what should be the dating of the samples based on how far they were away from the body. And they come out, the dotted line is what he postulated, and the lines with the diamonds in the middle are what the datings actually came out to be. So based on the radiant theory, the carbon-14 datings are right in line with what he would postulate would have happened. So the radiation fall-through hypothesis accounts for the body images as best as we can see. But what about the blood? We haven't really talked much about the blood. The blood is very important. The blood marks don't quite correspond with the image because the shroud collapsed and slightly flattened, causing the image to be encoded inside some of the stains. And in fact, what I did is I took my same outline, and I jabbed myself in the face 2 times. No. I used a little ketchup. And if I had the blood just in front of my ears, and if I had poked myself just in front of the ears, and then I open this up, look where they fall. So where the blood landed on the shroud was based on where the shroud was wrapped on the body, whereas the image was made totally different. It was made from vertical radiation streams. And so that makes sense as to why the blood isn't always sitting where it would logically sit. You have a hard time thinking a forger would come up with all this, wouldn't you? Listen to what Arthur Lind and Mark Antonacci say. The shroud not only appears to have wrapped a dead body, but even blood marks in parts of the body not originally in contact with the draped or underlying cloth were encoded onto it. There were parts of the blood, for example, some of the blood coming off the skull, they don't see why that would be in the outside parts of the hair. And they're saying those kinds of marks and others that shouldn't be really on the shroud are on the shroud, which makes you wonder, did the shroud collapse into the blood? Going on, they say, although these blood marks vary in size, shape, and intensity, they are congealed and pristine while showing no signs of having been broken or smeared at their edges. They are not just encoded, but are embedded in the cloth with the same shape and configuration as when they formed and coagulated on the body. Serum surrounded borders with clot retraction rings are revealed by photographic enlargers and ultraviolet lighting on blood marks throughout the entire body. So when they take blood and they let it clot and they look at it under UV lighting, you get a halo of the serum because the ultraviolet light fluoresces it. This phenomenon wasn't even known until the 19th century. And so if you were a forger, you would have to come up with all these ways to make sure this was figured out and understood. Now consider this. If the cloth had been removed from the body by any human or mechanical means, some, most, or all of these intimately encoded blood marks would have been broken or smeared at the edges. Although the body clearly left the cloth within 2 or 3 days, it did so in a mysterious manner. So we have this cloth with this blood on it that has no broken edges, including in those halos, which you can't even see. It's like taking off a Band-Aid. There's no way you can transfer the blood that's sitting on your skin and the way that is forming a clot and transfer that to a cloth, pull it away, and not have some smudging of some sort. You can't do it. They've never found, there's just no way. They've tried and tried. There's just no way to do it. So the evidence from the blood, the conclusion has got to be that the body was never unwrapped. Think about the implications. The blood is sitting there in the same way it was on the skin of the man in the shroud. It was never unwrapped. Those cloths are just laying there with the blood in the exact same formation that was sitting on the top of the skin. So what happened to the body? Science is stumped. But we aren't. In John 2:18 it says, "The Jews then said to him, 'What sign do you show us as your authority for doing these things?' Jesus answered them, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.' The Jews then said, 'It took 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?' But he was speaking of the temple of his body. So when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he said this, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had spoken." So do you believe? And I'm not talking about the shroud, I'm talking about the resurrection. Because we have evidence from the Bible. You read the Bible and it clearly points to a resurrection. We have evidence from historical Jesus studies, which I've spent a lot of my life trying to understand from a historical point of view, the evidence that we have, and it's overwhelming that the disciples from historical literature, the disciples believed they saw the risen Christ, and they went to their death and went through persecution preaching that message. And then now we have the shroud. I mean, the evidence is overwhelming. And so it tells us in Romans 10:9 what we do about that. It says, if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. For whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. I don't know for sure, but it just seems like maybe God gave us the shroud to add to the evidence in our modern time, to help us to know that what we believe is not some sort of fairy tale, it's a real live event that took place. And you, if you don't have a relationship with God, he's calling on you. He's giving us evidence through the Bible, through history, through the shroud, I believe, that indeed he rose from the dead, he's your Savior, and he wants a relationship with you. So if you want a relationship with him, he's just telling us right here, this is what we do. We call on his name. We believe in our heart that Jesus Christ raised from the dead. And if you would like a relationship with him, just pray along with me. Dear God, I know I'm a sinner, and I trust you. I believe you. I believe you sent your son. I believe that my sins can be forgiven by putting my trust in you. Lord, I give you my life. I give you my heart. I want to make you my Lord. In your name, amen.